On April 16, 1996, a man by the name of James Patterson Smith walked through the doors of Gorton Police Station in Manchester, England. James informed police that he had accidentally killed his own girlfriend following an argument they had in the bathtub. He told them he tried to revive her, but due to the amount of water she had inhaled, he was unsuccessful. Police arrived at the scene, discovering James's home covered in blood. Upon finding the body of 17-year-old Kelly Ann Bates, it was apparent that this crime was no accident. The case would go down as one of the most violent and inhumane crimes in English history. A case that may have been able to be prevented if something had been done about the violence James displayed in his past. Born in approximately 1948, James Patterson Smith would go on to become a serial domestic abuser. When he was around 22, he entered a marriage that lasted the next 10 years. It's unknown if abuse took place throughout the entire decade, but eventually the marriage would come to an end in 1980 due to James's violence toward his wife. From a distance, James seemed to be a well-put-together man who stayed away from alcohol and drugs. But behind the scenes, he was an insecure, jealous, and violent man. Following his 10-year marriage, he began seeing 20-year-old Tina Watson, a 12-year age gap between them. The violent nature of James became more extreme, with him using Tina as his own personal punching bag. The couple even became pregnant together, but the relentless beatings from James did not slow down. Tina describes the beatings as, "At first it was just now and again, just a little tap. But in the end, it was every day. He would smack me in the face or hit me over the head with an ashtray. He would kick me in the legs or between the legs. James even went as far as to attempt to drown her while she was bathing, something that he would come to enact many more times on other partners. But thankfully, Tina was able to escape the relationship in 1982. That same year, when James was 34, he began seeing 15-year-old Wendy Mottershead, a 19-year difference between them. This relationship was no different, with frequent beatings taking place, as well as another attempted drowning in the kitchen sink. By this point, it was alarmingly clear that James was a dangerous and violent person who could not be trusted in a relationship. But this didn't stop him from meeting 14-year-old Kelly Ann Bates. James, who was now a 45-year-old man, met Kelly while she was babysitting for friends of James in 1993. He offered to walk her home to keep her safe, and from this point on, James began grooming young Kelly. Prior to this, Kelly was described as sporty, social, and a bit of a tomboy. She lived a healthy, full life with 2 brothers and loving parents. Over the next 2 years, Kelly became more and more distant, eventually leaving home for hours at a time to the dismay of her parents. James had groomed Kelly into a secret relationship with him, which went on without the parents' knowledge. Kelly reached age 16 and told her mother she was seeing an older man. This was initially not a surprise to Margaret, Kelly's mom, because Kelly was a mature child who often hung around a slightly older crowd. But as months passed, Kelly finished school, and James's grasp on her only grew stronger, with her moving in with him before he even met her parents. Kelly hid the exact age difference from her parents, but the day finally came when it was time for them and James to meet. Upon meeting James, Margaret was struck with a flood of emotions. The 47-year-old John Denver-esque man was nothing like the person she had imagined for her daughter. She discovered there was a 32-year age difference between the two and begged Kelly to find someone else, telling her she could do better. But James had a strong grasp on Kelly, and there was nothing within the law her parents could do to get her away from him. Kelly eventually turned 17, and the relationship had only become more turbulent, with arguments becoming more and more frequent. This resulted in Kelly briefly moving back home, but James didn't give up. He stalked her and eventually convinced her to come back to live with him once again. They were back together before the end of November 1995. Her parents began noticing bruises and marks on Kelly's skin, but she averted their suspicion by telling them it was from accidents she'd been in. In December of 1995, Kelly became increasingly distant. She quit her part-time job and hardly had any contact with her family. Months passed, with her parents becoming more worried the longer they went without seeing her. Finally, in March 1996, they received letters which were supposedly from Kelly and James. The cards the letters contained were for Kelly's parents' anniversary, as well as her dad, Tommy's birthday. However, the contents of the card only contained James's handwriting. This did not ease the fear and worry her parents felt. It made them determined to go see her, But one of Kelly's brother's friends reported that he saw Kelly out recently and she seemed okay. Margaret and Tommy were so relieved they didn't think to ask exactly when. They would later come to find out that the friend was referring to a sighting from December. Hardly anyone had seen her since January, with the most notable sighting of her being from an upstairs window in James's home. Although concern for Kelly's well-being was at a high, months had passed and no one had heard from her. Tragically, they were too late to save her. Over a period of 4 weeks from the middle of March to the middle of April, Kelly was subjected to brutal, relentless torture. James had tied her up to radiators or chairs using a rope around her neck, or sometimes even her own hair. With her being unable to fend for herself, James put her through cruel, inhumane conditions. He'd starve her and deprive her of water, causing her to lose 45 pounds in the weeks leading up to her death. The physical beatings he inflicted upon her were no less harsh. Among her injuries were the following: scalding to her buttocks and left leg, burns on her thigh caused by the application of a hot iron, a fractured arm, dozens of stab wounds caused by knives, forks, and scissors, including stab wounds inside of her mouth. Both of her hands had been crushed. Her ears, nose, eyebrows, mouth, lips, and genitalia were all mutilated. Multiple wounds caused by a spade and pruning shears, and a partial scalping. James even went as far as to gouge out Kelly's eyes sometime between 5 and 21 days before her death. Additional stab wounds inside of her empty eye sockets were also found. All of these injuries were spread out across 4 weeks, making the last month of her life a living hell filled with agony. At last, James had beaten her in the head with a shower head, and then proceeded to drown her, something he had attempted to do to multiple women before Kelly, but in this instance, he had unfortunately succeeded. She died on April 16, 1996, at which point James turned himself in at the Gorton police station, stating that he had killed her on accident. When the police arrived at his home, it was glaringly obvious that nothing about what James had done was accidental. It was a targeted attack intended to inflict as much pain and terror as humanly possible. James had lost his humanity in this horrendous display of torture. The medical examiner is quoted saying, "In my career, I have examined almost 600 victims of homicide, but I have never come across injuries so extensive." Kelly had over 150 separate injuries to her body, and had felt the pain of every last one of them. When the trial had begun, James denied murdering Kelly, claiming she had taunted him. He told the court that she had a bad habit of hurting herself to make it look worse on me. He claimed he had blinded, stabbed, and brutally beaten Kelly because she had dared him to do it. A consultant psychiatrist told the court that James had a severe paranoid disorder with morbid jealousy, and that he lived in a distorted reality. It took the jury only 1 hour to determine that James Patterson Smith was guilty of the murder of Kelly Ann Bates. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, where he remains to this day. All members of the jury were offered professional counseling to help them cope with the gruesome details and photographs of this case. And for the first time ever, every single member of the jury accepted this offer. Kelly's mother, Margaret, expressed regret, saying, "I want him to die just like Kelly did. I know I shouldn't say this, but I wish I'd killed him the first time I saw him. That way, Kelly would still be alive." However, the only person to blame is the monster who was James Smith, a serial abuser who ended up in prison after it was far too late.